Well, good afternoon, Frank. Since we last spoke, a lot has happened, and as you look at it to begin with and try to bring it all to mind, it seems to be a lot of different things. But I think, in fact, much of what's going on shows us how the rate of change in the world as a whole is increasing, and the amount of participation by ordinary people in events in different parts of the world is increasing, when that seems to me to be particularly interesting from the point of view of the study of globalization. I don't know what stands out in your mind more than anything else.
Well, it's an interesting point you raise, because it's funny. It almost, in my mind, goes back to maybe 8 years ago in China, in Beijing in particular, with the Falun Gong, who used to be able to almost instantly assemble huge numbers of people in various public squares for protests. And it was confounding the authorities for a period of time until they, I guess, eventually usurped the communications networks and penetrated them. And then you see it now in the United States in social events. They have these so-called flash mobs, where usually young people and teenagers, because of social media, are able to congregate in one place like instantly and be there, and they confound the police and law enforcement. And to some extent, we've seen it in the Arab Spring. And actually, before that even, in the contested Iranian election in Tehran last year, all right, we saw social media putting together mobs of people very quickly, and then we saw it picked up in the Arab Spring, and then now we're seeing it in the United States in this protest now, which is going on for 18 days on Wall Street, which is now spread to Philadelphia, to Chicago, to Los Angeles, and to Kansas City. So it's very interesting what's happening. I mean, we always sit here and we talk about globalization and increased velocity of interactivity and talking about it almost on a, I don't want to say a geologic kind of basis, but almost like in a long-term process. But now we have instances where very immediately and very quickly things are happening, like right in front of people's eyes, and the established institutional forces are finding it very difficult to react to.
And in each case, a lot of different sorts of people are coming together in the protest, and the authorities don't know how to deal with it.
Indeed.
And when they do reach a certain level of success, then they're not quite sure why they're all supporting the same thing, or what in fact their demands are. And there seem to be more and more occasions where the actual governments that have the power to do things are stepping off on the wrong foot. So we had just recently well, we've sold more arms to Taiwan.
Yes.
We've been party to, well, the Security Council vetoed sanctions against the government in Syria, which actually the United States was on the, I suppose, on the progressive side of.
Yes. Yes.
But the United States vetoed, or says it's going to veto, the move by the Palestinians to get recognition. So there seems to be a situation developing in which governments are not keeping up with the rising awareness of people of the street.
Well, we discussed this last time, actually. In fact, you very specifically raised this point, is the inability of institutions and governments to be able to respond to these fast-moving trends of globalization. You're correct.
In Afghanistan, which is, after all, in the headlines almost every day.
Yes.
We have this very peculiar situation in which there are protests in the capital city on the part of the people who are the subjects of the government, the official government regime in the urban situation, protesting against the status quo, which they see as the fault both of the Americans and of the Taliban. On the other hand, the Taliban are controlling much of the country and extending their control recently, as I think you pointed out, by restricting cell phone communication.
Correct. Yeah, they're knocking out. Well, they're not knocking out physically, but they threaten to knock out physically and then physically take out the personnel in charge of operating them, unless these towers go dark from 6 p.m. until 6 a.m. And this is in wide swaths of the country. So in most places, even in Kandahar, service is out for 12 hours a day. And it's not, apparently, again, this was on the front page of the New York Times yesterday. I read the article closely. It's apparently not being done from a strategic sense of a strategic advantage kind of thing. It's more done as a statement effect, saying we're going to show the populace that we still have a tremendous amount of authority, and we're going to shut the service off for 12 hours a day.
And in Iraq, the decision appears to have been made that the U.S. forces, if they do stay beyond the end of this calendar year, will not have any sort of immunity against local legal.
I saw that.
Prosecution, which I think is also a mark of the increasing power of ordinary people in Iraq, as distinct from the actual government.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that might be a little unprecedented. I'm not so sure that in the 50s and 60s, American troops in Germany were not exempted, I mean, unless for capital crimes, perhaps, were not exempted from, say, West German law.
I'm not sure about Germany, but it's certainly been something that European powers have expected since the beginning of the 20th century in the colonial territories, and well, occupied territories were occupied for one reason or another. It was a big issue in Iran in the 60s and 70s, even though American troops were not actually occupying Iran at the time, but nevertheless that they requested, and I think the Shah gave them immunity from prosecution. I forget what the technical term is, and that was one of the factors that was brought up in the revolutionary movement.
Okay. It's interesting because I spent most of last week in London and had an opportunity to read the British newspapers every day, as well as to watch BBC One News, and it really is a decided difference there, in that it's almost a declared statement of fact that the intervention in Afghanistan and in Iraq are United States blame. It's all U.S. fault. And number two, it's all wrong. So the Obama policy is always described adjectively as a disaster, a disastrous failed American policy in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And it's like you would describe like the Speaker of the House, John Boehner. These words always appear before the proper name of John Boehner. It's like the failed American policy in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, it's anybody before they say those words has to give that adjective phrase. It's very interesting, considering that they're allies in both instances.
But I think the division of public opinion between America and Europe at some levels may be diverging, but at other levels there's certainly a similarity in the pressures that come from public awareness of what's going on. And there's generally an unhappiness in Europe against the Euro situation.
Oh.
And we're waiting to see what happens at the party conferences in England this week and next, to see whether the current coalition government policies to right the economic situation in England actually survive, because I think there's evidence of rising discontent with them, but no actual public demonstrations against them so far, except by students earlier on in the year.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's interesting because you've seen mass demonstrations in Athens against the austerity cuts brought on by the government. You've seen demonstrations in Paris by Sarkozy's proposed budget. You've seen some student demonstrations in London about the rise in tuition prices. But in the United States, which has historically always been a guns and butter kind of society at the same time, all right, now for the first time you see demonstrations, but they're not anti-government demonstrations, they're anti-financial institution demonstrations. And it's sort of like, when are the Europeans going to realize this? I mean, instead of protesting in front of the Greek Parliament, maybe they should be protesting in front of the Greek banks, or maybe they should be protesting in France in front of the French banks who hold a lot of the Greek sovereign debt. I mean, this truly is, and I can get exercised about this. If I was younger, I'd be up on Wall Street. But I mean, this truly is something.
But I think that in Europe, it's the governments that are getting the attention, because it's the governments that are enforcing the austerity. Whereas here, that's not such an obvious attention getter. It's more we hear more about the bonuses that are paid out by the banks than we do about austerity measures imposed directly on people by the government. I think that's probably the reason. I think if the headlines were to change, it would look much more similar. Anyway, the point that I wanted to make was that this sort of, more and more we see that something's happening everywhere. And even Burma has been in the news, that there is, the government is beginning to give in more and more to, one assumes it has something to do with public opinion, although I haven't read any raw data about that yet. But there's certainly been a change in government orientation.
I have seen Aung San Suu Kyi more frequently in the news, so just the mere fact that she is seen is hopeful.
Yeah. Then the other things that I was going to point out was that the global financial situation has some interesting new factors in it that have been pointed out since we talked last, and the most attention-getting one is the fact that India is now investing in the UK. So Tata, which I remember as an enormous business in India when I first started going to India in the 1960s, is now the biggest foreign investor in the United Kingdom. And so the relationship between India and England is not really being turned on its head, but it's certainly being reorganized in a way that we wouldn't have foreseen for some time. And I think that this is part of a global process where at one end of the spectrum there's more evidence of awareness among ordinary people, and at the other end of the spectrum, the actual relationships and negotiations and attempts to work together among governments and multinational corporations, big authorities, is changing. The patterns of everything are changing.
The patterns of everything are changing, and it's interesting. You may recall from your knowledge of London geography, I don't recall the name of the road. It's a private road, and it is the road that Kensington Palace faces onto. It's at one end of Hyde Park, and on that road, which is access is controlled by the police with automatic weapons on both ends of the road. It connects from Bayswater all the way down to the other side of the park. And on that road are mansions owned by foreign governments, ambassadorial residents, chanceries, and there are 3 or 4 ancient, huge mansions that were purchased and owned and refurbished by the people who control the Tata company and their family members. They bought 3 of them in a row right next to each other, and the price was something like £40 million that they then proceeded to refurbish at God knows how much money. And that's simply accepted. That's just pointed out, oh, that's the people from the Tata Corporation. It's very interesting. I mean, who would have imagined that 100 years ago?
Yeah, yeah. No, the rate of reorganization that comes with a redistribution of influence that comes from the redistribution of population throughout the world seems to be accelerating to the point where one can see the consequences of it almost certainly every week, from week to week.
Well, as you pointed out at the start, this is a week where the symptoms are appearing just about everywhere.
Okay, I think then we'll leave it at that until we see what's happened in the next week.
Thank you, Brian. We'll talk next week.